Hello, I'm Grady King with Church Resources in Oklahoma Christian and Hope, co-leader of Hope Network Ministries. And this is our inaugural experiment with a webinar called Thinking Christian about life and faith and culture. And our first guest today is Grant Testut, who teaches Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and at Oklahoma Christian University. And we'll be discussing the ever-present message of the prophets. So welcome, Grant. Glad you're here today.
Thanks, Grady.
When I think about the prophets, Grant, I'm thinking about the stereotype of prophets. I mean, they're the doom and gloom guys. There's an old message. They use lots of poetry and weird imagery and language. And, why in the world would we want to dive in to the prophets, particularly in light of today's culture? Can you just help us frame that a little bit?
Yeah, the prophets are a strange bag to deal with because they share certain things in common with us. They are believers. They worship the God that we do. And yet they have so many particulars that are distinct from our own experiences. They come from a culture and language vastly removed from our own. And they reference events which are current for them, but well in our past. And so that puts us in many ways out of touch or out of sync with them. And so what I like to do in my classes is help students get on board with that journey of learning what it is to hear the prophets first in their context and see precisely what they were doing in that context as faithful people serving God, and then learn how we can translate that activity into our current setting. I can give you an example if you like.
Go ahead.
Begin with a thought experiment with my prophet students when they are in my class. I read this poem. This is a poem by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and it is after the style of the Lebanese-American Khalil Gibran, and it's called Pity the Nation. And I don't introduce, I say to the students very specifically, I'm not trying to lead you one way or another. I want you to hear this first of all, let it resonate with you, and then I ask them some questions. So I'll give you this example. Here's his text. Pity the nation. Pity the nation whose people are sheep and whose shepherds mislead them. Pity the nation whose leaders are liars, whose sages are silenced, and whose bigots haunt the airwaves. Pity the nation that raises not its voice except to praise conquerors and acclaim the bully as hero, and aims to rule the world by force and by torture. Pity the nation that knows no other language but its own, and no other culture but its own. Pity the nation whose breath is money, and sleeps the sleep of the too well-fed. Pity the nation, oh, pity the people who allow their rights to erode and their freedoms to be washed away. My country, tears of thee, sweet land of liberty.
Wow.
And I let that sit with the students. And I ask them, after a few moments, I say, does this or does it not sound like something that the prophets of Israel would say? Does this sound like a prophetic kind of discourse? And I leave it with them. I say, feel free to say no, in no way, or yes. But if they say yes, I want qualifications. What exactly sounds like the language of prophets, or what doesn't? And we have to understand that clearly I'm using that piece because I myself see some connections there between at least the kind of discourse that Ferlinghetti was using and that used by ancient Israelite prophets. I'm not equating the two in terms of all of their motivations as if they are coming from exactly the same position. But it becomes a great launching pad for discussion for these modern believers to think critically about, if we do hear something in the tones of that poem that sound prophetic, what is it that sounds like the prophets? Typically, one of the first things that I get out of students is one or two will start to notice he has that refrain of pity, pity. And to them, they notice that sounds, especially if they've read enough of the Old Testament, they say that sounds like woe, woe. One of those refrains repeated by prophets like Isaiah. Or in our Christian context, that's a famous refrain of Jesus himself in Matthew 23, right? Woe, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. A term which is a term of grief, of sorrow, not merely of chastisement, but it is language of great inner turmoil for the sake of one's audience. And so here is somebody who seems to be moved on behalf of his people, in this case, the nation. But how different is that from ancient Israelites who are grieved on behalf of their nation? A nation for them which was tied with their very religion as well.
Wow. When you speak of the prophets or the prophetic voice, and the way you read that, pity the nation, in that parallel, I really like that. But the thing is that oftentimes we've stereotyped prophets as just future teller. They're just telling the future. They're telling the future. So the role and function of a biblical prophet was to speak for God in regards to specific, fill in the blank there for me.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great summary of the role of a prophet. Prophets were those women and men who were perceived as being especially gifted by God himself with a unique message to deliver to the people. And since we get the impression from a number of scriptures in the Old Testament that this could be a career calling for many of them, then these were people, at least some of whom, had frequent visitations from God, frequent messages given to deliver to the people and interpret the times for them. So that's another piece of all of this. It is as much as any number of us are interested in hearing from God and wanting that sort of guidance. Where is God wanting me to go? What would God have to say to me? And I should have my ears perked up for that. Nevertheless, I think majority of us would say we find that oftentimes very difficult to perceive. What is the true guidance of God? How do I discern that from false trails? And so the prophets in their ancient Near Eastern setting, and I'm saying this not just for Israel, but other people groups as well, they perceived that role of the prophet as an interpreter of whatever signs God might have given. Now we're many of us most acquainted with dreams, visions for Israel's and Judah's prophets as a vehicle by which they received messages from God. But we have to realize that even for Israel, that was not the only means of communication they seem to have had with God. Many in our audience will probably be well aware of the Urim and the Thummim. What in my field of study we would call divinatory devices, some sort of a tool, in this case, according to Torah, a tool that was sanctioned by God himself as a means for discerning what God's message was. That might not be a message which comes across as clearly as a dream or a vision would, but it was some system for understanding what God intended his people to understand. For other peoples around the Mediterranean at large, or the Near Eastern world, they would read anything from bird signs sometimes to sacrificial livers, all in that effort to see how God might be speaking into their lives, and if God is, we ought to pay attention.
That's so foreign to the way the Western world processes. There's this kind of this Eastern worldview and this Western worldview, and most all of us that are listening to this grew up in a Western worldview, I would assume, and so it's really hard for us to get our minds around. And the prophets, when you talk about that world, they were pretty tangible about the abuses in their nation and in their culture and the surrounding nations around them. I mean, and so I'm thinking of the word social justice keeps coming to mind. I mean, that's really thrown around a lot today, and it's a lot in, African-American culture. Social justice is a big theme, and in white culture, it's not been as big a theme because we're probably the ones in power historically. But what is when you hear social justice, what specifics do the prophets deal with that we would consider social justice? That it's not just tied to the hippie movement of the 60s where people of my generation.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and I think it's a key question when you think in my field of study about where a lot of that language was bubbling up in the articles and in the books that were coming out. A lot of that was concentrated in the 60s and 70s when social justice was freshly on people's mind. You had any number of social revolutions happening, and even entire nations. A number of nations were leaving their colonial status and gaining independence. So there was a lot of this language of liberation, justice, freshly on people's minds. And there were those in my field who started to make connections. You know, they started to say, hold on, this is not necessarily a new thing. We've seen something like this in the ancient prophets before, addressing this very thing of justice for the people. At the same time, I think a number have been wise to, I don't know if you want to say slow the pace of that enthusiasm, but we want to remember that for Israel's prophets, the very impetus for justice, and they do talk a lot about justice, it begins and always begins with God. God is the beating heart
Right.
of any of Israel's or Judah's prophetic movements. And we must never lose sight of that centrality. In fact, if I can read you another little snippet, this is from Walter
Please.
Brueggemann. I'll even show you there. This is his The Prophetic Imagination.
That's a great work. I love that work.
I highly recommend it to anyone in the ministry if you want to think about how to keep your message vital and fed by the Word of God. But here, this is a book that first came out. Its first edition was in 1978, so it's coming out after those 2 decades of so much social movement and a lot of this enthusiasm for social justice of the prophets. But he cautions, he's very careful about how he lays out the uniqueness of Israel's prophets and their call by Yahweh God. He says, and this is on the first page of his introduction, the contemporary American church is so largely enculturated to the American ethos of consumerism that it has little power to believe or to act. This enculturation is in some way true across the spectrum of church life, both liberal and conservative.
Yes.
So one thing that Brueggemann sets out at the very beginning of his introduction is that one can go too far in either of these directions, and one's major motivation can become the party motivation. But the party motivation is just a slightly bigger ego than my own ego. It is still a limited body, a limited organism. Even if I might have learned to sacrifice my own self-interests for my party, my town, my church body, whatever, that is still a body that is answerable ultimately to God. And if I forget that, then I am in danger of the very heart of idolatry, which is to stop short of the divine for something that is more manageable, something concrete that I can control.
Wow, that's let me interrupt you there. That is an incredible thing because of the way we understand idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we think, well, we don't have idols today, but Paul reframes it in the New Testament. Greed, your idolatry and greed are together. Yeah. But unpack that a little bit more about the idolatry in the prophets. Could you do that?
Yeah, and here too, just because it's convenient, I can read another little snippet from Brueggemann, but then I want to comment on this because there's so much to unpack here that really summarizes the depth of what is happening in the prophets. So this is just a couple pages later. He writes, "The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us."
Wow.
The power systems in play. And he says, "Thus I suggest that prophetic ministry has to do not primarily with addressing specific public crises, which might include social justice, not with addressing specific public crises, but with addressing in season and out of season the dominant crisis that is enduring and resilient, of having our alternative vocation co-opted and domesticated.
Well, those
There's a lot.
alternative vocation, co-opted and domesticated. Take that apart just a minute or two.
Yeah, so this is what bears unpacking, because Brueggemann writes so densely, and he doesn't want to waste words, and so there's a lot going on there. What is meant by this is our alternative consciousness, the consciousness that God's people should have about themselves, is that ongoing awareness of God's ways. To put this in a New Testament context, which is very relevant for us, this would be the kingdom proclamation of Jesus and his first followers.
Right.
We proclaim this sort of sovereignty of God over against any other power system that might be out there in the world, no matter how legal they think they are, no matter how just they think their programs are or their platforms. None of them is the end of all things, but the ultimate determiner for us is the kingdom, God's ethic. And so being called always back to that, we put ourselves initially in a very vulnerable state. Because, and this is true of all organisms, first thing that's often present in our minds is our survival. How do I perpetuate this? Beginning in infancy, we scream for that sustenance that we need. And then as we are matriculated in our society, we are taught by degrees to give up some of that self-interest and pour it into the greater community. That's good. That's a great first step. Think about your family, or think about your responsibility to your church, to your country, what have you. Any of those can represent some sense of expanding my awareness, my consciousness beyond just personal need and personal defense. But like I mentioned before in our interview, that stops too short if that's where we end up. Because even that entity, you might say that that's like going from the individual to a planet. But think about how many planets are in the galaxy alone, the universe. And so we realize by degrees that the center of the universe is shifting. It's kind of like the Copernican revolution. We're realizing that the Earth is not the center of the universe. And now we move from that to the sun is the center. And then we realize, oh my goodness, the sun is only one of billions and trillions out there. And we're not even at the center of our galaxy. Goodness. So what Brueggemann is arguing for here, and many of us in the discipline would agree, is that Israel's and Judah's prophets are primarily concerned with bringing the conversation back to the real center, which is God. And because God is who God is, Yahweh who called forth Moses saying, I am who I am, you can't put a name to this, and was the same God who, because of his nature that you can't pin down, was the same God who had the ability to free the slaves out of Egypt, his people, Israel. Then that allegiance to God, hearing the voice of God, being attuned to what God would say to us, will produce fruit like that, fruit that would mean justice for those who have not received it, because they are made in the image of God, and things like this. Whereas, and again, I'm falling back on Brueggemann, it's convenient, at least as a starting point. He begins with Moses as the archetypal prophet of Israel, as if he is essentially the one who gets the ball rolling on, if you want to be a prophet, follow this example, what Moses does. And when you think about Moses and his call to prophethood, he goes forth to a key political figure, in this case, Pharaoh, and says this bold message, which is not going to be well received, let my people go. And when you think about how would that stand with this political leader who is interested in the preservation of his society, who isn't?
Sure.
He's concerned with what will happen to Egypt, our people, if we slacken the workload on these Hebrew slaves. All he's thinking of is the party line. How do we support this system? And how many of us could say we haven't done the same thing at various points in our lives? But he has to hear that fresh voice
Right.
from God, an alternative consciousness to the one where he had been camping out, that said, no, you've stopped too short. You're trying to create a bubble that you think is stable and secure, but that's your idol. That's your idol. It's an idol is ultimately our self-deception that we have found God. We have found stability and power to feed into our lives, but we are stopping short of that utmost trust in the power of the divine. To do so puts us in a vulnerable position.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus tells his followers, take up your
Right.
cross and follow. If you want to be a part of this life, you're going to have to lay down your life. And so it's not a comfortable message for any of us to hear. And a great many of us never want to hear it. We have to be dragged kicking and screaming.
Yes, certainly the prophets are calling then, and they call people to repent, to turn, to change back to God, and back to God being this center, this orienting part of their life. And so the prophets then, they do paint an alternative future.
Yes.
They paint an alternative future. They're calling for an alternative future for God's people. So, I'm thinking of specifically, the Micah 6, 6-8, walk humbly and love justice and, be merciful. That passage. I'm thinking of, Amos's call, let justice roll down like waters in Amos 5. I'm thinking of passages to where they're imagining a new future. They're not just, as you pointed out, doom and gloom. They're calling people back to God as the center for a new reality. So, in Isaiah, you got the root of Jesse in 11. You've got the come drink of the waters, that division in 55, and comfort the people in 40. I mean, so can you talk a little bit about this idea of alternative future? Because a lot of times I hear preachers today and say, well, that guy really spoke prophetically. Well, sometimes that means he just told it like it was, but that's not what we're really talking about here. He tells it like it is. Well, that may be a tiny little part of it, but to speak prophetically means that you're also speaking hopefully because of this God that's at the center.
That's right. So it has to do yet again with the fact that you're learning a new center than the one you've been relying on. And that demands a dramatic shift. It demands a shift that often enough requires grief before hope. We have to realize the sad situation for what it is. Yeah. And this is why so many prophets are well known for their woe statements, their grief statements on behalf of the nation, because they're trying to get the rest of their society, they're trying to waken everyone up to the reality that we've painted over the real situation with these pretty deceptions, these falsehoods that have been comforts for us. But we have to wake up and realize that that's just whitewashing the situation. And the reality is much more grim. So let's own that first. And again, this is why you have to have Jesus's chapter-long discourse to the religious leaders in his situation. They have to be woken up themselves if there's going to be any change for them. So it begins with mourning, but it doesn't stop at mourning. And mourning and grief can be productive toward something that's more real, ultimately, something that is grounded in God. So we take our brokenness, our contrite spirits to God and find that the healing that we were always looking for, the security, will be in God's hands. But it's always going to be that fresh reminder that if you're going to have that hope, it will not be your doing. This is something that the prophet Ezekiel, for example, is very keen on saying in Ezekiel chapter 36. On behalf of Yahweh, he talks about Yahweh's promise that he will restore his people to their land, and using language very similar to the prophet Jeremiah, that he is going to give them a new heart, and that he's going to give them his own spirit. He's going to pour that into them so that they will finally do what he had commanded them to do all along. But there's the fresh reminder there always, It is not even for your sake that I'm doing this, says the Lord. I'm doing it for my own name, which you all, those of you Judahites who found yourselves in exile, you brought all this shame upon my name, because essentially the subtext there is, because you ended up in exile, that made your God appear weak versus the Babylonian gods. Or at the very least, it made him look detached from his people.
So name becomes power. It's powerful, the concept of God's name, because name is identity and character of who God is. And so I'm thinking of that New Testament passage about the name of God is being blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you.
Yeah. So
I know that's just one
is indicative of who you are. That's your reputation. And it's that reminder that for the prophets, the impulse to go forth and speak a message does not begin with social justice. Though I want everyone listening to hear me correctly. Social justice is going to be a part of their message. You don't have to read very far in the prophets in the Old Testament before you will find a message like that. But it begins always with, what is God's prerogative? What is God's agenda? And how have we lost sight of that? How does that need to become our agenda?
Wow.
But because you know the name of Yahweh, you know what is communicated by the nature of Israel's covenant God, then you ought to know, just as well as you know that name Yahweh, that he stands for the most neglected members of his people. That he may be a lofty God, higher than the greatest heights, and yet his eyes are down there among the lowliest.
So you see the constant emphasis on widow, orphan, stranger, alien, or we could say immigrant maybe.
In fact, the Hebrew term there that we often have translated as sojourner or resident alien is better translated as immigrant.
Now that makes it really, really powerful. And so, well, in the time we have left, let's kind of bring this down to, starting in about the first week of June, I said, well, I'm going to spend 1 week reading a different prophet. So I started at different prophets, and I would just spend every morning reading, and I started with all the major ones. And I noticed this theme of the correlation between worship as ritual and ethics, that this worship and ethics go together. And he constantly, the prophets were constantly addressing them, Isaiah 1's indictment, when it leads into, so worship and ethics go together. Can you get, what's God really after ultimately?
Yeah. Well, I've quoted from so many other sources already. I think it would be most fitting to wrap up with a quote from the prophet Isaiah, speaking to this very thing, right? Let's read some of that context from Isaiah chapter 1, and beginning in verse 11. Isaiah 1 verse 11, he says, "What is all this abundance of your sacrifices to me, says Yahweh? I have had enough of the whole burnt offerings of rams, the gristle of fatlings, the blood of bulls, lambs, and goats I do not enjoy. When you come to appear before me, who seeks this stuff from your hand, this trampling of my courts? You should no longer continue to bring empty offering. Incense is an abomination to me. The new moon, Sabbath, and calling of assembly. I cannot bear evil and the solemn observance. Your new moons and your holidays my soul hates. They have become like a burden upon me. I am tired of carrying them. When you spread out your hands, I hide my eyes from you. Even though you multiply prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and be clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease doing evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Justice is present there. Seek justice. Make the ruthless. Walk rightly. Deliver the orphan. Plead the case of the widow. Come now, let us reason with each other, says Yahweh. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall become white like snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall become like wool. If you are willing to listen, you shall eat the goodness of the land.
Wow.
Notice how that ends on hope. Eventually, Isaiah gets them to that message of hope, which
Yeah.
is God's message, but not before grief. The recognition of how broken they are must come first, and how broken their idols are. Their trust that has been invested in the systems they have created. And they have to be made to see that the systems that they have put their trust in, that they think produce a life of security, stability, order, cleanliness, ultimately might be nice for some, but it also spells a lot of suffering and trauma for others.
Wow.
Mm.
Boy, this has been rich. There's so much I want to ask, like the covenantal nature, that, you know, the covenant, how it came in, and the concept of love. I mean, love is in the prophets. The prophets talk, I'm thinking of Hosea 11, kind of the pinnacle of the Old Testament in my mind, about when Israel was a child, I loved him. And so we think, well, the God of the Old Testament was bad and the God of the New Testament was good. That's just not true. Maybe that could be another session sometime.
Should I insert one more thing, Grady, before we
Sure.
leave? Yeah. And that is regarding the same passage. And this is one thing I think our audience would do well to take home and think about, what can we as Christians do today with this burden of the prophets, and take it upon ourselves. When we as modern Christians hear that language of, you know, what do I care about your sacrifices, and who requested this trampling of my courts? Well, we have to remember that in their context, their answer, if they were asked to answer God here, might be, well, didn't you ask us? Didn't you command us in Torah to bring these sacrifices? We're just being religious. We're just being dutiful and pious. We're bringing the best things to you, our offering. And here we might challenge ourselves to say, how might we modernize the language of these prophets in such a way that it would waken up our modern audiences, including our religious audiences of the faithful, to say something like, who required of you these baptisms? Who asked you to come every Sunday and muddy up my church with your communion? I'm sick of it. I detest that. Imagine God saying such things. That's how that would sound to an ancient Judahite who was bringing, you know, their offerings to the temple of Yahweh. They would be aghast at the idea that Yahweh doesn't want that, doesn't like that. And yet it's brought around to what you need to focus on is plead the case of the widows, the orphans, the immigrants. Look at them here in pain, suffering, in cages, and all of that, and consider whether that is really serving God.
And that kind of worship is what God's after. Is that wow, that is good stuff.
And we see that in Jesus as well. Jesus speaks in the same vein in the gospel. He does not spend all of his time talking about the proper ordinance of rituals, but he spends his time talking about the poor, the widows, the orphans, the immigrants.
So as a last question, real quickly, is what practical advice would you give to someone that said, all right, I'm going to go back and start reading the prophets? Where do they start? Who would be a good prophet to start with? And you know, where does somebody start? Because a lot of people, you know, I remember doing a 12-week series of the minor prophets over the summer. And after about the third week, this lady came up and said, Brother King, can you move to something else? It's the same message every week.
Yeah. Well, you can take a note from Brueggemann. You might start, as some do, with Moses. You know, maybe you think of him as this standard of prophethood, as one of the first. And if anything, that can break us of a cycle where we think of Moses as the lawgiver. But we have to remember that he's much more than that. He is the man who gets the privilege of negotiating a covenant between Yahweh and Israel.
Yeah, it's dialogical. Yeah.
And so in that role, he has to be the voice box for God.
So rethinking Moses would be a good place to start.
Moses would be a good place to start. You can go to what we call non-writing prophets. Even those that have narratives written about them are just as informative. So when you read the life of Samuel the prophet, or when you read about the life and times of Elijah and Elisha, you start to see what early prophecy in Israel might have looked like. And you see that just as much in those times, you have people that call kings and other political leaders to account for injustices.
Good
And
stuff.
to reorient them back to Yahweh and away from their pet systems, their idols.
And that I can't think of a better place to stop than that, is reorienting back to Yahweh rather than our pet systems and idols. Well, thanks, Grant Testut, for joining us. You can contact Grant through the OC website, grant.testut@oc.edu. If you need resources or dialogue about this, thanks for joining Thinking Christian about life, faith, and culture.
Thanks for having me.